Hi, my name's Jackie Finlay and I'm a solicitor at Legal Aid in the Government Law team. This webinar provides a short overview of the NDIS and will give community workers a better understanding of how their clients can access the NDIS and what supports they may be funded. The National Disability Insurance Scheme, or the NDIS, gives people who have a permanent and significant disability the reasonable and necessary supports they need to live an ordinary life. People accepted into the scheme will get an individual plan and an individually funded package of supports to manage themselves if they choose. The scheme is for people who had significant difficulties with activities such as communication, mobility, social interaction, self-care and self-management. The scheme is for people with all types of disabilities, physical, intellectual or psychiatric. It's a fundamental shift from the previous way of providing services to people with a disability, where service providers were block funded and they determined what they offered people with a disability. The National Disability Insurance Agency is the government agency that administers the scheme. So in this webinar today, we'll cover briefly 3 topics. 1, becoming a participant in the scheme. 2, the supports available once a person's in the scheme. And 3, their appeal rights. But first, a little bit more of an overview of what the NDIS is. So there are 2 main roles of the NDIS. The first is giving information and providing referrals to existing services and supports in the community to people with a disability and to capacity build mainstream services. This assistance is for anyone in Australia who has a disability, which the government estimates is around 4.3 million of us. And the second role is providing individual funded packages of support to people with a disability with significant care and support needs. The government estimates by 2019 there will be approximately 475,000 people who are participants in the scheme. The National Disability Insurance Scheme Act creates the framework for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It sets out the eligibility criteria to enter the scheme and what supports and services will be given to participants of the scheme. This law is supported by detailed rules, the National Disability Insurance Scheme rules. And sitting below those are the operational guidelines. They're used by the NDIA to make its decisions and provides more detailed guidance to decision makers. So who can become a participant in the NDIS? Well, a person must meet a number of criteria. Firstly, they must be less than 65 years when they first access the scheme, although they can choose to stay in it after they've turned 65. Secondly, they must be an Australian citizen, a permanent resident of Australia, or be a New Zealander who's a protected special category visa holder. Essentially, it's the Centrelink rules. And thirdly, a person must meet either the disability requirements or the early intervention requirements. So a person meets the disability requirements if the person has a disability that is permanent or likely to be permanent and results in substantially reduced functional capacities in an area such as mobility, self-care, self-management, social interaction or learning. Alternatively, a person can access the NDIS through the early intervention requirements without having to show substantially reduced functional capacity. Instead, the early intervention requirements consider the likely trajectory and impact of a person's impairment over time and the potential benefits of early intervention. Either way, through the disability requirements or the early intervention requirements, the person's disability must be permanent or likely to be permanent. And one final note on eligibility is there's no means test, so a person can become a participant regardless of their personal income and assets. As at March 2017, 65% of participants have an intellectual disability or autism, which is a higher percentage than was anticipated. 5% of participants have identified as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islanders, which is approximately what was expected. But wasn't anticipated was the large number of 7 to 14-year-olds who would be entering the scheme. In New South Wales, they make up 24% of the participant population. Next, we'll turn to looking at the planning process. So once a person is accepted as a participant in the NDIS, they then need to start the planning process. Firstly, the person prepares a statement of goals and aspirations. And this includes information about the person's daily life, about their current relationships and the supports they get from other people, and the goals about what they want to achieve once they get NDIS funding. It's really important that a person gets support to clearly articulate what it is they hope to achieve into the future. Once a person's done their statement of goals and aspirations, they meet with a planner for a planning conversation. Now, for a small number of people, this will be with an NDIA planner, someone who works for the agency. But for many people, they will meet with a local area coordinator, a LAC, who have been contracted by NDIA to provide NDIS services. They'll meet with the person and help them prepare the plan before taking it to the NDIA to see if it's approved. It's important to note that while someone might meet with a LAC, in fact, it's the agency that will approve a plan, not the local area coordinator. The person's plan will then be created and will include the reasonable and necessary supports that we've funded. A plan also has a plan review date, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. So a person's NDIS plan will look like the picture on the screen, and it'll set out what sort of funded supports will be provided. So that might include help for daily care, such as showering, feeding, toileting or dressing, help with household tasks, cleaning, looking after the backyard. It might include funding to help the person participate in the community. It may include therapeutic supports, so funding to see an occupational therapist, a physiotherapist or a speech therapist. The plan will also contain supports for things like home modifications or vehicle modifications if that's appropriate. And finally, it'll include funding for any mobility equipment that a person needs. A person can also receive funding under the NDIS for a support coordinator, and that might be a really important support for our clients to get funding for. These support coordinators have a really great role in helping people locate different service providers who might be able to meet their person's need, and helps them navigate and make a choice between all those different things on offer. They'll also help person keep track of their NDIS funding and make sure they're not overspending it or underspending it. In order to fund a support, the National Disability Insurance Agency must be satisfied that the support is reasonable and necessary. The law lists 6 criteria that must be satisfied for each support in order for it to be considered reasonable and necessary. So let's go through them each in turn. Firstly, the support must assist the person to pursue their goals. So you can see why it's really important that the person has gotten support from somebody when they're setting out their statement of goals and aspirations at the beginning of the planning process. Secondly, the support must facilitate the person's social and economic participation. Now, that doesn't mean that the person has to have found a job once they get funded supports under the NDIS, merely that by having some money to fund service providers to offer them supports, the person is participating in the economy. Thirdly, to show something is reasonable and necessary, the NDIA must be satisfied that that support is value for money, relative to both the benefits achieved and the cost of alternative supports. So the NDIA might go to a person and say, there is an alternative support that's cheaper and we think we'll fund that. And the person will need to set out why it is that that more expensive support will better help them achieve their goals and therefore can be considered value for money. Fourthly, a support must be effective and beneficial for the person, having regard to current good practice. The NDIA will consider published research to determine what's good practice, as well as talk to the person's treating doctors and therapists, but they'll also take into account the lived experience of the person with a disability. So that person can point to previous periods where they've had a particular support and service and can articulate the benefits that they've achieved from having that support, then that is relevant to determining whether something is beneficial and effective and should be funded by the NDIS. Fifthly, the support must take into account what is reasonable to expect families, carers, informal networks and the community to provide. And lastly, the 6th criteria, determining reasonable and necessary. A support will only be funded if it's most appropriately funded or provided through the NDIS and not through another service such as health or justice or education. A person can choose how they want to manage their package of NDIS funded supports. The options are they can self-manage the funding, and that's where they enter into arrangements with service providers and they pay invoices and deal with all financial matters. Another option is someone can appoint a plan management provider. So that's somebody else who'll manage their funding for them. And they can actually get extra NDIS funding to cover that person's cost. Another option is that the person can ask the NDIA to manage the funding. That option is only available if the person is happy to go with service providers who've registered with the NDIA. And then there is the option, I guess, of choosing a combination of all of the above. So a person might have most of their supports managed by the NDIA because they use registered NDIS support providers, but they might have one or two people that who aren't registered who they like their services and they would like them to offer the support, and they can pay them directly. The only funding that a person will actually get paid directly into their bank account, though, is transport funding, which is generally paid to them on a quarterly basis. So far, throughout the early days of the scheme, most people, about 74%, have chosen to have their plans solely managed by the NDIA because it's quite a complex process to do that yourself. Another important thing to know about plans is plan reviews. So an NDIS plan will include a plan review date. So normally that's 1 or 2 years after the plan starts. And leading up to that date, the NDIA must review the person's plan and prepare a new plan. However, a person can seek review of a plan at any time. It might be important for someone to know this if their circumstances change during their plan period. So, for example, their mother might be their primary carer, but she herself takes sick and is no longer able to provide the support and care that's needed. The person can approach the NDIA and ask for a plan review as their circumstances have changed and they therefore have a higher need for funding. The last topic we're going to cover in this webinar are a person's review rights. So most decisions made under the NDIS legislation can be reviewed. For example, if a person is denied access to the NDIS because the NDIA is not satisfied that they meet the disability requirements or the early intervention requirements, a person can challenge that decision. Another decision they might want to challenge is the funding that they've been given. So if the NDIS refuse to fund a particular support or don't provide enough funding so the person can get that support or service, the person can challenge that decision. Another decision they might want to challenge is the NDIA may refuse to review the person's plan even though there's been a change in their circumstances during the plan period. And other decisions are reviewable, things about nominees, compensation and plan management. There are 2 stages to the review process. Firstly, internal review by the National Disability Insurance Agency, and then if the person's still not satisfied with the review decision, they can apply to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal for review. It's important to note that they can't miss a step, so if they want to challenge a decision, first they must ask the NDIA to review its decision before they have the right to go to the AAT. A person must request internal review within 3 months of the NDIA's written notice of a decision. Time doesn't start running if no written notice is sent to the person, but if it is, the person only has 3 months as no extensions of time are available. A request for review may be made by writing to the National Disability Insurance Agency or requesting it orally, or alternatively, there's an application form on the NDIA website. The NDIA will review the decision and will give its reasons in writing to the person. If a person is still not satisfied following internal review, they can apply to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal for review of the decision. Applications to the tribunal about NDIS matters are free, and there's no cost if they're unsuccessful in their review. The AAT is independent of the NDIA, and it tries to conduct the matter with as little formality and technicality as possible. There is a 28-day time limit to appeal to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal from the internal review decision, although the AAT can grant an extension of time. A person can apply to the tribunal by lodging an application form or making a request in writing, so maybe sending it by email. A person who seeks review in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal is entitled to an NDIS appeal support person to support them through the process. These support people are employed by disability advocacy organisations, and they can help the person lodge their appeal and will assist them through the various stages of the tribunal, including case conferences and hearings. The Commonwealth Department of Social Services also has legal funding available for matters that are complex or novel at the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. This is funding that's been made available during the early stages of the NDIS. Legal services that are funded by the Department of Social Services are provided by Legal Aid New South Wales. The NDIS Appeals Support Person can help the tribunal applicant apply for that legal services funding. Well, that ends our webinar for today. But if you need advice for a particular client, you can contact your local legal aid office to make an appointment. Well, thanks for listening and keep an eye out for other legal aid webinars.